Today we will be discussing Japanese expansionism, right from the Meiji Restoration in the 1860s, right up until the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and with it the end of World War II in 1945. So this will be covering in all of the major acts of expansion carried out by the Japanese Empire. So in particular going into Korea, China, Russia, all that stuff. So, without further ado, some background. Now, prior to 1853, Japan was isolated from the world. Well, aside from the Dutch, they were fine with the Dutch, being out trained with the Dutch in the port of Nagasaki, but that was it. And then, in 1853, in comes Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy, who comes in to Japan and using something known as gunboat diplomacy, tells them, you're going to trade with us and you're going to like it. And imposes some unequal treaties. This makes the Japanese government, the Japanese shogunate, look very weak and incompetent. And so the Japanese emperor, who prior to this point was pretty much just a puppet of the shogunate, and in this case is Emperor Meiji, decides to take matters into his own hands. In 1860, he does the Meiji Restoration, basically declaring that he is the absolute authority in Japan. And whilst there is a lot of some resentment to this and resistance, such as with the Boshin Wars, where basically Meiji's forces went up against the old samurai, and the samurai lost badly. So he was able to come out on top, and he was able to implement wide-sweeping reforms. He was modernising Japan, industrialising Japan, fostering a sense of Japanese nationalism, and building an education system based on that of Prussia, building in a proper standing army and navy, and actually democratizing Japan as he installed a Japanese parliament, rather similar to the Westminster system of the UK, as Japan under Meiji's rule effectively sought to learn from these Western cultures, apply those learnings to Japan, and basically turn Japan into a great power of its very own. And as well, they didn't want another Matthew Perry coming over. They wanted to be able to stand up and be recognised, and effectively to be recognised by the other European powers as a major power themselves. But in order to be a major power, you need some additional territories. And the Japanese home islands were overpopulated at the time, and lacking space and resources to continue building and industrialising, so they needed to expand. And so they began trying to go into Korea, an area of contention as it was between them and China. China, of course, having previously felt the full brunt of European imperialism earlier that same century, and as such in 1898 began the First Sino-Japanese War, which saw the more modern and professional Japanese troops effectively mow down the largely untrained Chinese conscripts, securing Japan the island of Taiwan, as well as a protectorate over Korea. This brought it into conflict with Russia, as Russia has always wanted a warm water port of its own, and in this case, they had managed to acquire some control over the Chinese port of Port Arthur, now known as Dalian, and while Japan was also seen their sights in this area, this all being part of the Chinese region of Manchuria. And eventually, the two sides came to blows, and quite famously, Japan won a massive knockout victory against the Russians. With, of course, one of the most famous examples being the Russians sending the entire Russian Baltic fleet all the way around Africa, all the way over to Korea, only to then get effectively pulverised by the Japanese. And also firing on some English fishing boats. That Russian Baltic fleet voyage was certainly something. But in any case, the Japanese won and were able to fully annex their protectorate of Korea and begin to get some inroads into Manchuria. Something else important that happened during this time was the Anglo-Japanese alliance, where Japan secured a proper alliance with Britain. Now, this was significant for Japan as this sort of marked the first time where it's truly been seen as another major power, another great power, and by European power, no less. And this alliance would also end up dragging them into World War One. Japan didn't get up to that much, considering that, well, they were in the Pacific, but they did still quite easily seize a number of the German colonies in Asia, most notably including the German treaty port of Qingdao and a number of Pacific islands that the Germans were also holding on to. However, after that point, things began to take a turn for the worse. This for Japan, as the military began to take further control over domestic and foreign affairs. And the Japanese democracy that had been built under Meiji quickly began to falter, as the Japanese army began to become more autonomous until 1931 and the Manchurian crisis. This saw the Japanese army stage the Mukden incident, an alleged false flag incident where basically a Japanese-owned train in Manchuria was blown up, and this was taken as a pretext to invade and occupy the region. This was a rather massive international controversy, and since Japan was a member of the League of Nations, and so was China, who technically owned Manchuria, even though China was sort of split up into warlords at this point, but anyway, they appealed to the League of Nations. The League of Nations launched an investigation, known as the Nilitten Commission, which basically ordered Japan to withdraw from Manchuria, and Japan responded by withdrawing from the League. And so they grew even further isolated from the influence of the European powers and got an even more independent foreign policy. Then we come to the Second Sino-Japanese War, as well Japan, not content with its already decently sized gains in Manchuria, now sought to control all of China. And so in 1937 the Marco Polo Bridge incident occurred up in Beijing. And Japan used this as its pretext to launch a full-scale invasion of the rest of China. China at this point had been broken up into, well, the main government, the Republic of China, referred to as the Nationalists, and the Communists, led by Mao Zedong, along with a whole smattering of different warlords who had all sort of decided to unite under the banner of the Chinese United Front in order to resist Japan. And this invasion is perhaps most well known for how utterly brutal it was for the Chinese population, as Japan just committed endless war crimes, such as the rape of Nanking, which saw them do such things as having their soldiers create a competition to see who could chop off the most heads within an hour. And there were also some other humanitarian crises, such as when the nationalist government, in order to slow down the Japanese forces, blew a number of dams along the Yellow River, which caused some of the most deadly floods in history. However, in spite of Japan taking a number of China's largest cities of Beijing, Shanghai, Nanking, the invasion quickly ground to a halt as they began trying to move into the countryside, and the Chinese moved their capital further inland. and eventually Japan would effectively just be ground down to a complete halt in China, and would face continued losses for not much real gain, which had been the whole point of the invasion, to gain resources and power, and yet they weren't able to get that and weren't able to properly achieve their goals and were suffering greatly for it. Then we get into their southern expansion. They had two expansion doctrines. The northern expansion doctrine, which against the Soviets, which they had attempted. They had held some border skirmishes, which they had then quickly lost, and so they abandoned that in favour of the southern expansion doctrine, which would see them carve their way down into the European and American colonies of Southeast Asia. Now, this started off in 1940 with the Japanese invasion of French Indochina, as well. France had just fallen to the Germans, and so Japan took control of it. This angered the Western powers, and Britain and the US responded by embargoing Japan, and in particular an oil embargo, which was particularly crippling for Japan as they got most of their oil from the United States. And so this led them to, Pearl Harbor, as they believed that the only way to secure the future of the Japanese Empire was to launch a quick, decisive campaign against the Allied powers in Southeast Asia. And so they launched the attacks on Pearl Harbor, and then followed up by launching attacks on those European colonies. Now, this obviously didn't go too well in the end, and after some initial successes, Japan would then be pushed back, and after some island hopping, a Soviet invasion of Manchuria, and of course, most famously, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan would finally surrender, bringing an end to the Japanese Empire. And what it left in its wake was a power vacuum across much of East Asia, power vacuum in China at least, that would be filled by Mao's communists, with the declaration of the People's Republic of China in 1949, which would eventually go on to overtake Japan as the dominant power in East Asia. So ultimately, the legacy of the Japanese Empire and its expansionism would end up being a rather different Japan, a Japan that was broken and then rebuilt effectively from the ground up by the Americans. It's a new Japan, a new, more democratic, less militaristic Japan, and beyond that, a fractured East Asia that would then come to be consolidated under the banners of Communist China, North Korea, and the other nations of Southeast Asia that would then break free from their European colonizers over the coming decades. So that was the full story of the Japanese Empire from beginning to its end. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any further questions at all, please leave them in the comments below. I will try to answer as many of them as I can. And be sure to like, comment and subscribe. And I will be seeing you in the next video, which should be coming out sometime next week. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.